Tonight, I will tell you a quiet story about a man whose mind was much louder than a thunderstorm. But on this particular morning, the real storm had not yet arrived, and the air in the valley was strangely, heavily still. The town of Riverbend sat deep inside a lush green valley. It was a peaceful place, divided right down the middle by a wide, fast-moving river. The water was always rushing over smooth gray stones, creating a constant, calming sound for the people who lived there. But high above the town, inside a small, dusty room with a single glass window, there was absolutely no calm at all. This was the studio of a young architect named Julian. He was a brilliant man, gifted with a very sharp mind and steady hands. Yet, if you opened the heavy wooden door to his room, you would not find a successful builder. Instead, you would step on mountains of crumpled paper. His large oak desk was completely covered in thousands of beautiful, perfect bridge designs. He drew intricate iron arches with deep concentration. He carefully calculated the weight of thick wooden beams. He knew exactly how a strong bridge should stand against the heavy wind. But there was a sad, terrible secret hiding inside this room. Julian had never actually built a single bridge in the real world. His mind was a chaotic, crowded place. Every time he picked up his pencil, a loud voice in his head would begin to whisper terrifying doubts. He was completely paralyzed by his own endless thinking and a deep fear of making a mistake. He stood alone by his dusty window, looking out at the fast-moving river below. He spent his days worrying endlessly about a future that had not happened yet. He did not know that very soon, nature was about to force him to stop thinking and start doing. A mind full of fear cannot build anything real. For Julian, every single day inside his quiet studio followed the exact same exhausting routine. He woke up early, sat at his large wooden desk, and watched the morning sun shine through the dusty glass. He picked up his favorite sharp pencil and carefully drew a strong, straight line for a new wooden beam. He calculated the angle, the weight, and the tension perfectly. It was a beautiful design, but immediately the loud noise in his head started. It was a chaotic voice that he could not control. What if the heavy wood rots in the autumn rain? What if the thick iron breaks under the weight of the town's carts? What if the bridge falls and everyone laughs at me? His breathing would become fast and shallow. A cold panic would fill his chest. Before the drawing was even finished, he picked up his rubber eraser. He rubbed it aggressively against the paper until the beautiful bridge completely disappeared into a messy gray smudge. He was exhausted by his own overthinking. One cloudy afternoon, the quiet safety of his studio was broken. He heard the sound of heavy footsteps climbing the wooden stairs. The thick door swung open, and the mayor of Riverbend walked into the room. The older man looked incredibly serious, and his dark coat was wet from a cold mist. "Julian, we have a terrible problem," the mayor said, his voice tight with worry. "The old wooden bridge in the center of the town is cracking. The wood is rotting, and the river is moving much faster than usual. I am officially hiring you today. You are our only architect. We need a replacement, and we need it soon." When the mayor left, the pressure inside the small room felt absolutely suffocating. Julian's mind became more chaotic than ever before. Building a real bridge meant facing real danger. He could not just erase a mistake in the real world. He pulled out fresh sheets of paper, desperately trying to calculate the absolute perfect design with zero risk. He spent hours analyzing every single detail, trying to think his way out of the fear. He thought he was being highly productive, but his mind was only going in endless, stressful circles. Suddenly, the quiet safety of his studio was violently interrupted. Through the open window, echoing all the way up from the deep valley, came a loud, sharp cracking sound. It was the terrifying, heavy groan of old wood breaking under intense pressure. Julian froze, his pencil dropping from his shaking hand onto the wooden floor. He desperately wanted more time to think. He wanted to analyze the problem for just one more week. But the river was not going to wait for a perfect drawing. Endless analysis is often just a quiet, comfortable way of being trapped inside your own mind. Weeks passed in the quiet valley of Riverbend. The green leaves on the tall trees slowly turned to a dark, wet brown. A heavy, freezing autumn rain began to fall over the town, soaking the earth. But Julian did not notice the changing seasons at all. He stopped sleeping almost entirely, Deep, dark circles grew under his tired eyes, and his face became pale and exhausted. Instead of going outside to measure the wet riverbank or working with the brave townspeople to gather heavy wood and thick iron, he stayed, locked inside his dusty room. He was desperately trying to think his way out of a physical problem. His large wooden desk became a messy, chaotic mountain of crumpled paper. He drew a beautiful, strong stone bridge, but then his loud mind whispered, "What if the mud is too soft to hold the heavy stone?" He immediately erased it. He drew a flexible wooden bridge, but his mind instantly argued, "What if the fast river washes the light wood away?" He erased it again. Pages of ruined blueprints flew to the wooden floor like dead autumn leaves. He filtered absolutely no thoughts. He believed every single irrational fear his brain produced. The loud noise in his head was completely deafening. He held his head in his shaking hands. "If I just think about it a little longer, I will find the perfect answer with zero risk," he told himself. He truly believed that more thinking would eventually create perfect safety. He thought that if he analyzed every possible disaster on paper, he could somehow prevent it from happening in the real world. Outside his dusty glass window, the storm grew much stronger. The cold rain hit the glass with a heavy, relentless rhythm. The river below was swelling, changing from a calm, peaceful blue to a thick, angry brown. The water moved faster and faster every single day, tearing small trees and large rocks from the wet riverbank. The danger was very real, and it was growing by the hour. Yet, Julian sat quietly in his comfortable wooden chair. He felt a false sense of safety among his dry, perfect papers. He was completely ignoring the dangerous rising water just outside his door. He looked down at another complex blueprint, carefully adjusting a tiny pencil line. He thought he still had time to find the perfect answer. He was completely wrong. Sometimes the world breaks your perfect plans so you can finally take action. It happened in the middle of a terrible, completely dark night. Julian was staring at another complex drawing, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. Suddenly, a massive, deafening crack echoed through the entire valley. The terrible sound violently shook the glass window of his studio. He dropped his pencil. His heart pounded wildly in his chest. He grabbed a heavy iron lantern, pushed open his thick wooden door, and ran outside into the pouring, freezing rain. His boots slipped in the thick, wet mud as he rushed blindly toward the center of the town. When he finally reached the edge of the riverbank, he held up his flickering lantern and gasped in pure horror. The old wooden bridge was breaking apart right in front of his eyes. Splintering wood flew violently into the dark air. The roaring, muddy water crashed heavily against the weak supports. With one final, terrible groan, the center of the old bridge collapsed completely. It crashed into the raging river and was instantly washed away into the darkness. The only connection between the two sides of River Bend was gone. Julian stood frozen in shock. Half of the town was now completely trapped on the other side of the valley. The dark, angry floodwaters were rising very quickly toward their small homes. Through the heavy, freezing rain, he could hear the terrified screams of the villagers. They were panicking in the dark, shining their own small lanterns across the rushing water, desperately looking for help that was not coming. In that terrifying moment, Julian realized something profound. All of his beautiful, perfect paper plans were sitting on his dry, safe desk. They were completely useless. Paper could not save people. Endless thinking could not stop the rising flood. The loud, chaotic voice in his head tried to shout at him again. What if you make a mistake? What if you fail them right now? What if the new wood rots? But the fast river did not care about his fears. There was absolutely no time to think. There was no time to draw a perfect, risk-free design. He had to build a temporary bridge right now. He had to use only the broken pieces of wood, the fallen trees, and the heavy iron chains that were already on the muddy bank. He dropped his lantern in the mud. He took a deep, shaky breath, letting go of his endless analysis. By the time the dark clouds covered the moon, his safe, quiet studio was completely behind him, and the roaring river was at his feet. Action is the only true, lasting cure for a completely chaotic mind. Julian stood knee-deep in the freezing, thick mud, shouting desperate directions to the wet, terrified townspeople. The heavy autumn rain mixed wildly with the dark brown earth, making every single step a massive, exhausting struggle. But the people of Riverbend did not give up. Men and women worked closely together in the dark night. They pulled with all their strength, hauling huge broken tree trunks and dragging incredibly thick iron chains toward the dangerous edge of the roaring river. At first, the loud noise in Julian's head was almost as deafening as the terrible storm itself. The familiar, chaotic voice screamed at him through the freezing wind. What if the thick brown ropes suddenly snap under the terrible pressure of the water? What if the muddy bank collapses and we all fall in? What if I fail these innocent people right now? His exhausted mind desperately wanted to run away. It wanted to retreat to the quiet, dry safety of his studio, to draw just one more beautiful blueprint, and to think about the jackers' problem just a little bit longer. The endless overthinking tried its hardest to paralyze him one more time, but Julian looked at the frightened faces of his neighbors, and he finally realized a powerful truth. He could not listen to the noisy, anxious voice anymore. For the very first time in his entire life, he forced his mind to filter the chaotic thoughts. He stopped analyzing the scary, unknown future. Instead, he forced his brain to focus only on the physical reality directly in front of him. He looked at the next heavy wooden plank. He looked at the next wet rope. He looked at the next heavy hammer strike. He reached down into the mud and grabbed a heavy metal hammer. He raised it high into the freezing rain, his muscles burning with effort. Clang! The loud, sharp sound of solid metal hitting a thick iron nail cut perfectly through the noisy storm. Clang! As his hands blistered from the hauling and the cold rain soaked his clothes, something absolutely incredible happened inside him. The chaotic screaming of his mind suddenly went perfectly quiet. The endless, terrifying overthinking was completely replaced by the grounding physical rhythm of true hard work. The temporary structure of rough wood and thick rope was slowly extending across the dark, angry water. It was certainly not a perfect, beautiful bridge on paper, but it was a real, solid bridge built with brave action. And still, the greatest, most terrifying test of his imperfect bridge was already rushing down the dark river toward them. True clarity comes in the exact moment you finally stop thinking and completely trust yourself. The temporary wooden bridge was finally complete. The wet, exhausted townspeople from the other side began running quickly across the rough wooden planks. They held their crying children tightly against their chests, and they carried their small, flickering lanterns through the freezing autumn rain. The rough structure was shaking violently under their heavy feet, but it was holding together. Then, a terrifying new sound echoed from up the dark valley. It was a deep, crashing sound, much louder than the roaring river. A massive, dark tree trunk, completely uprooted by the terrible storm, was flowing rapidly down the river. It was crashing violently through the angry white water, destroying everything in its path, and it was heading straight for the central support beam of Julian's new temporary bridge. Time seemed to completely stop for the young architect. Julian stood frozen on the muddy riverbank. Instantly, his chaotic mind tried to pull him back into his old, dark trap. The loud noise in his head returned with a terrible, paralyzing force. His brain began calculating a dozen different ways they might all die. If the heavy tree hits the beam at that exact angle, the wood will splinter into pieces. If the thick iron chain is too loose, the entire bridge will collapse and wash away. If I try to fix it now, I might slip into the freezing river and drown in the dark. His brain was spinning in endless, terrifying circles. It was desperately trying to find a perfectly safe answer where absolutely no risk existed, but there was no perfectly safe answer in the real world. Julian looked at the screaming villagers running across the shaking planks. He remembered his dusty, quiet studio filled with thousands of perfect, completely useless drawings. He finally realized that endless thinking could not save them now. He had to actively reject the loud overthinking. He had to completely trust his own brave instinct. If I hesitate to think, everything washes away, Julian told himself, his heart pounding wildly. I must just act. With a sudden burst of intense, clear focus, Julian grabbed a heavy, swinging iron chain from the thick mud. He did not pause to analyze the cold wind. He did not stop to calculate the exact speed of the rushing water. He simply ran out onto the wet, shaking bridge. His boots slipped wildly on the wet bark of the rough planks, but he did not stop to worry about falling. He kept moving forward into the deafening storm. He reached the exact middle of the bridge and jumped down onto the slippery central pillar. The massive dark tree was only seconds away, roaring through the white water like an angry monster. His chest was burning, his hands were bleeding, and the storm was completely deafening. But as he wrapped the heavy iron chain around the wooden joint to secure it, his mind was finally beautifully clear. An imperfect bridge that stands strong in the storm is always far better than a perfect bridge that stays safely on paper. The massive, dark tree trunk violently smashed into the exact center of the temporary wooden bridge. The terrible impact was completely deafening, echoing through the valley much louder than the thunder above. The rough, wet planks groaned loudly under the terrible weight, bending sharply against the incredibly angry river. For one long, terrifying second, it seemed like the entire structure would break apart and wash away into the dark, freezing water. But it did not break. Julian's heavy iron chain, wrapped quickly and tightly around the wet wood in a moment of pure instinct, held remarkably strong. The fast river crashed heavily over the dark logs, and the cold wind howled through the valley. But the central pillar remained solid and, surprisingly, calm. The rough, ugly bridge survived the terrible blow. On the muddy, slippery riverbank, the wet and exhausted townspeople began cheering loudly in the freezing autumn rain. They hugged their crying children tightly and held their small, flickering lanterns high into the dark, stormy sky. Every single person was finally safe on the same side of the valley, rescued from the rising floodwaters. Julian slowly climbed up from the slippery central pillar. His entire body was shaking violently, and his burning muscles were completely exhausted from the intense physical labor. He collapsed onto the solid, wet earth, breathing heavily, and rested his muddy, bleeding head against the strong, wet wood of the bridge he had just built. As he sat there in the cold rain, a profound, life-changing realization washed over his tired mind. He looked closely at the bridge he had just created with his own hands. It was ugly. It was rough. It was certainly not mathematically perfect like his beautiful drawings, but it was absolutely real. His months of perfect thinking in his quiet, dry, safe room had almost destroyed the town. All of his beautiful, complex blueprints had been completely useless when the real danger storm finally arrived, but his quick, imperfect action in the thick mud had actually saved everyone. He finally understood that endless, theoretical worry only creates a false, dangerous sense of safety. True, lasting clarity comes from taking practical, physical action, even when you are deeply afraid of making a mistake. The loud, anxious, terrifying noise in his mind was finally completely gone. It was beautifully replaced by a deep, peaceful silence that he had never felt before. He was no longer just a frightened boy drawing pretty pictures in a dusty, quiet room. With his bleeding hands, his muddy boots, and his clear, quiet mind, Julian was finally a true, real builder. Let us look at Julian's journey from a distance. If we watch his life like a quiet movie, it feels very simple and easy to understand. Julian lived in a small, green town near a fast, wide river. He was a very smart architect, a person who designs buildings and bridges. But his mind was always full of loud, scary thoughts. He sat alone in his messy, dusty room and drew thousands of perfect bridges on bright white paper. He never built a real bridge outside in the world because he was always too afraid of making a terrible mistake. He truly believed that endless thinking could keep him perfectly safe. One day, a terrible, dark storm came to the peaceful valley. The cold rain was freezing and heavy. The river grew very fast, very deep, and very angry. Julian stayed inside his dry, warm room. He tried to think of the perfect answer to the dangerous storm. He drew more beautiful pictures and then quickly erased them. His mind was going in endless, tiring circles. He was completely trapped by his own overthinking. He forgot that the real world was moving fast outside his glass window. In the middle of the dark night, the old wooden bridge broke with a loud, terrifying sound. It fell completely into the dark, rushing river. Half of the town was trapped in the freezing storm and the dark water was rising fast. In that terrifying moment, Julian finally learned a very important lesson. Beautiful paper plans cannot save frightened people from a flood. Endless, worried thinking cannot stop a real physical problem. Julian ran outside into the cold, thick mud. He finally stopped listening to the loud, anxious noise in his head. He stopped trying to be absolutely perfect. Instead, he took real, physical action. He picked up a heavy metal hammer. He worked bravely in the heavy rain with the townspeople to build a new, rough bridge out of wood and rope. When he started working with his hands, his chaotic mind finally became quiet and peaceful. Suddenly, a massive dark tree floated quickly down the angry river. It was going to hit the new, fragile bridge. Julian did not freeze in panic. He did not overthink the terrible danger. He grabbed a strong iron chain and jumped bravely onto the wet wood. He tied the heavy chain quickly and tightly to save the bridge. The heavy tree hit the bridge with a loud crash, but the wet wood and the strong chain held together. The town was finally safe. Julian rested his tired head against the wet wood and smiled in the cold rain. He learned that a clear, strong mind comes from taking brave action, not from endless worry. An imperfect bridge that stands in the heavy storm is always much better than a perfect bridge that stays hidden on paper. I used to live completely trapped inside my own head. For a very long time, I sat alone in a dusty, quiet room and drew thousands of beautiful, perfect bridges on bright white paper. I desperately wanted to build them in the real world, but I was absolutely terrified. Whenever I looked at a new design, I heard a loud, chaotic noise in my mind. I constantly thought, what if I make a terrible mistake? What if the heavy iron breaks and everyone in the town laughs at me? I felt completely paralyzed by my own fear. I truly believed that if I just thought about the problem a little longer, I could find a perfect, risk-free answer. I thought my endless analysis was keeping me completely safe from failure. But one dark night, a massive freezing autumn storm arrived in our peaceful valley. The cold rain fell heavily and the river became incredibly fast, deep, and angry. I stayed inside my safe, dry room, desperately trying to calculate a perfect solution on my wooden desk. Then, I heard a deafening crash that shook my glass window. I ran outside into the freezing, thick mud and saw the unthinkable. Our old wooden bridge had collapsed completely into the roaring dark water. I saw the terrified faces of my neighbors trapped on the other side, shining their small, flickering lanterns in the dark storm. In that terrifying moment, I realized something profound. All my beautiful, perfect paper drawings were completely useless. My endless, worried thinking could not save anyone from the rising flood. I felt a terrible panic rising in my chest. But I finally knew I could not listen to the loud, anxious noise in my head anymore. I decided I had to stop overthinking immediately. I left my safe room, let go of my fears, and picked up a heavy metal hammer. I stepped deep into the freezing mud and started building a rough, temporary bridge with the brave townspeople. My muscles burned terribly, and the cold rain hit my face. But as I worked hard with my own hands, I realized that the physical action made my chaotic mind perfectly quiet. When a massive, dark tree floated down the raging river toward us, I did not freeze to analyze the danger. I grabbed a heavy iron chain, jumped bravely onto the slippery wood, and tied the joints securely. The heavy tree hit us with a loud crash, but our imperfect bridge held strong. Now, when I feel the solid wood under my boots, I finally feel at peace. I learned that true, lasting clarity is found in taking brave action, not in endless worry. A quiet mind is not an empty mind. It is a focused, powerful mind. And so, Julian never went back to his dusty, paper-filled room to hide from the difficult, unpredictable world. When the warm morning sun finally rose over the peaceful valley of Riverbend, it shone brightly on a strong, real wooden bridge. It was certainly not a perfectly drawn bridge on a piece of bright white paper, but it was incredibly solid in the real, physical world. It was built with muddy hands, heavy iron, and true, undeniable courage. The loud, chaotic noise of fear in Julian's head was finally gone forever. Many of us are exactly like the young, frightened architect sitting alone in his quiet studio. We face a difficult decision, a new goal, or a big, unexpected challenge in our daily lives, and we become completely trapped inside our own heads. We falsely believe that if we just analyze the problem a little longer, we can find a perfectly safe path with absolutely zero risk. We let the loud, anxious noise of what if paralyze us, holding us back from the life we truly want to live. Endless overthinking is incredibly dangerous because it tricks us into feeling productive. You feel like you are doing something useful by thinking about the problem, but in reality, your mind is just moving in stressful, exhausting circles. The real world does not wait for perfect, risk-free plans, and it certainly does not reward endless theoretical worry. Sometimes, the only way to truly quiet the chaotic storm inside your mind is to step bravely out into the freezing rain and pick up the heavy hammer. When you finally stop thinking and start doing, the terrible fear slowly loses its power over you. The physical, practical act of moving forward brings a deep, lasting peace that endless analysis never, ever can. Always remember this simple, life-changing truth. A clear, calm mind is found in taking practical action, not in endless, anxious thinking. If Julian's quiet story helped you calm your loud mind today, please take a moment to gently like this video and subscribe to our channel for more calm, beautiful stories. I would love to hear from you. Tell me in the comments below, what is a project, a dream, or a decision that you are overthinking right now? Remember, you can always listen to this story again tomorrow to practice your English understanding, learn new vocabulary, and improve your listening skills. Thank you so much for sharing this quiet, peaceful time with me. Sleep well, trust your own inner strength, and always keep moving forward.